Right, good morning everyone and welcome to the show. What have we got for you today? Well, let's just remind you where you are and what you're watching. I'm Kevin Williams from Survival Skills Rider Training, and whilst we're all locked down with the coronavirus, I'm bringing you a series of live shows every Monday, Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, and hopefully keep you entertained with some topical news, controversial views and biking tips. Now, as you probably noticed, I've got a slightly new studio setup this morning, so once again, I'm learning a few new tricks every time I do this, so just bear with me if things just go a little bit awry from time to time. I might have to actually put my glasses on to see what I'm doing on occasion. Anyway, let's kick off with today's first. What makes for an iconic motorcycle? Well, I've been getting press releases about the Honda model launch, which was done virtually in Tokyo due to the lockdown. And one of the bikes which has appeared and been fairly heavily publicised is a CBF concept machine. And one of the words that's popped up fairly regularly on there, the press releases, is iconic. Now, we hear quite often, isn't it? It's what's the definition of iconic? Well, it's actually something that's invisible and also influential. Think Twiggy, the Mini, Big Ben, David Attenborough, and the BBC. They're all recognisable. We all know what they are. People outside our own sphere know what they are. And they're also influential. They've all been copied. You know, the Twiggy set a sort of modelling image, which has been imitated ever since. Likewise, the Mini introduced the sort of a small, affordable small car, and there'll be certainly plenty of Mini derivatives around, and so on with all the the other things I've just mentioned as well. We know what they are, and they've all influenced other people. So why do we might think that this CBF concept is iconic? Well, that's a good question, actually, because what is the bike in the first place? Well, it's actually a redressed version of the CB 1000R, which is itself a stripped down version of the CBR 1000RR. The difference is that this time it's been reclothed in a style that makes it look vaguely like the 1979 CB900F. You might remember there was also a 750 version for some markets. Now, looking at the bike, personally, I think that the restyle job actually takes the original bike, which I actually rather liked, and subtly ruins it somehow. There's a mismatch between that big chunky tank, which is one of the features that connects it with the older machine, and there's a sort of slimline rear end of the bike. The two just don't balance. Meanwhile, what do we want from a 1970s, 1980s machine? Couple of big round clocks. What have we got? Little tiny square block of an LCD display. So I think the styling cues go missing. What else is missing from the bike? I meant to mention the fact that the original was a twin shock machine. The rear of the new bike is conspicuously missing shock absorbers because it's a monoshock. Now, again, the styling cues from the old bike really aren't there. So to try to make a connection between the two, I'm all for updating models, and I'm not entirely dismissive of sort of the sort of heritage classic style what do they call them? Retreads, reruns, revamps. I'm not entirely against that, but if you're going to make it look like an old machine in new clothes, then make it look like the old machine in new clothes, not something that's a halfway house. Okay, so if the word iconic is all over the press releases, presumably Honda have used the word, although I haven't actually seen any of their stuff. So is the machine sort of really iconic, or is it recognizable? Is it influential? Well, let's just suggest two machines which are genuinely iconic: the Triumph Bonneville and the Harley Electroglide. Now, if you stick a modern Bonneville in front of a member of the public, or a modern Harley Electroglide in front of the same person, and ask them where it came from, they'll probably be able to talk about the heritage. They may not know the ins and outs of what goes on with Triumphs and Harleys, but they'll know roughly roughly why I came from. So I think that those bikes can genuinely be described as iconic because they focus back to the ancestor bike. But do the same with that CBF concept and ask an ordinary person, what does it remind you of? And I think you'll probably get a blank look from 99% of the general public. And to be honest, I think if you showed that bike to anyone much under the age of 50, because if you do the maths, you'll find that they won't have been riding back in the end of the 70s, early 80s when this model ran. I think you'll find that most of them won't recognize the sort of base machine that it's designed around. So, was the bike it's not recognizable, I don't think, to most people. Was it influential? Not really. The model only ran 4 years, and it certainly didn't give any long-lasting design cues, perhaps in the way that the original CB 750 did. The Fireblade, for example, has been running for donkey's years now, and that probably is an iconic machine. But the CB 900F, it might have had some racetrack wins, something that the Honda press releases have been banging on about. But ultimately, that CBF 900 was designed for the European market. It only was on sale in the US for 2 years. And here's the real irony, in my opinion. What bike do you remember that used that Euro styling? It will probably be the Humble 250 Super Dream. That's the one that probably leaps out at you because they were everywhere for a few years. They lasted a while, and they sold in shed loads. They fueled the sort of the last of the 250 L plate brigade. Sadly, I think that the calling that CBF concept iconic is missing the mark a little bit, over egging it. Funnily enough, actually, watching the releases from on YouTube, and I'll put a video up actually this bike in a moment. Watching what's been going out on the press releases from that virtual release, the bike that actually caught my eye was the CT125 Hunter Cub. It's a kind of stripped down C90 lookalike with I wouldn't say knobbly tires, but the idea is it's an affordable-ish. It's $4,000 apparently, which is a bit over the top, but it's an affordable-ish, go anywhere, do anything bike. And they show some videos of people sort of overlanding, standing up on the foot pegs, riding this little thing. Okay, so it's probably far too expensive if the dollar-pound exchange, which is normally 1-to-1, goes ahead, but it's an interesting little thing to look at. And funnily enough, I was thinking about putting an item on the smaller bikes into the next show, so I'll try and remember to do that. Okay, so that was the CBF concept and why I don't think it's iconic. Just a reminder, you're watching Kevin Williams here on the Elevenses show, which is coming to you on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays at 11. I'm just going to be talking about sequential indicators, answering a question from in a moment. Still to come on the show, I'll be looking at the new TT Isle of Man Ride on the Edge game. Bit of a mouthful, that, isn't it? And finally, I'll round off the show with the second part of my explanation of motorcycle suspension and how to use the brakes and throttle effectively to get the suspension working with you rather than against you. So that's all still to come on the show today. Right, okay, on to Simon's question. This is what Simon wrote to me earlier today. He said, "Would love your views on sequential indicators." Those are, I'm assuming, the ones that you're finding on the new Audis, which sort of start flashing from one end and move out towards the opposite end of the indicator. He says, "I'm stumped as to how they've happened and why they've caught on, as it seems stupid. When your indicator is on the left and you're turning left, why reduce the visibility by producing less light most of the time, by only lighting up one LED at a time?" He says, "I'm stumped by that." Yeah, well, I kind of agree. I mean, the idea of using lights in motion to imply that some movement is going to happen isn't new. Um, Whether or not it works effectively on the back of a car is a moot point. Personally, I find them a little bit distracting. I tend to get drawn to stare at the indicator rather than simply register that the indicator's on and then start thinking about what that means in terms of how the car's going to actually maneuver. Um, I take the point on the reduced output from the indicator too. But it's, to be honest, I don't think that all the manufacturers have had a particularly fine track record on producing lights that work effectively. Now, where did I first notice this? Do you remember the Ford Focuses from probably, oh, blimey, mounting lights high up on the back of the hatch? So they were basically at eye level rather than the more traditional sort of rear wing level of the car. Well, most of those were kind of not in your line of sight. You kind of had to glance up at them a little bit rather than directly at the back of the car in front, which is where you expect to find a light. But there was another problem as well. The lights at certain angles tended to catch sunlight. Because they were not square with the back of the car, not flat, as it were, but actually tilted at a slight angle away from you. So I probably should show you it that way around so that you can see what I'm talking about. The light came down onto the indicator and bounced out of the lens and reflector. And I can remember several times completely failing to spot an indicator or brake light coming on those cars because they were drowned out by bright sunshine at the wrong angle. Now, fairly quickly, they went out of use. They started putting the indicators back lower down where they've always been, so with brake lights, and just using a high-level light inside the rear screen. I wouldn't be at all surprised it was because people actually did run into the back of those cars, having failed to spot the lights. Now, there was one motorcycle which also suffered that problem. I can't remember the model name to save my life, but maybe it was the Silverwing. Yeah, it might have been the Silverwing. I remember running a course years ago with actually a police driver who'd taken up motorcycling in his spare time. Predictably, actually, he was quite a good motorcyclist. But one of the things I riding behind his bike was that at certain angles on that day where the sun was bright, the indicators were invisible. And I actually suggested to him that he used an arm signal to reinforce the indicator when the sun was behind him. Okay, so not everybody gets it right. My feeling on this is that there needs to be possibly more testing under all sorts of lighting conditions. And, we kind of just assume that you plonk lights on the back of a vehicle like that and it all passes and it all goes ahead into the build. But, sometimes you think, how much testing have they actually done? Have they really checked this out? I don't know. I'm not a fan of those flashing sequential lights, Simon. So I hope that answers your question. I suspect they're mostly what's it called, product differentiation in undifferentiated market. When all cars pretty much, then anything more car is something that the manufacturers will look for, and flashing LED lights sort of make, I think, people think it's a bit more upmarket than a basic indicator. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Is running every Monday, Wednesday. I'm going to look at the TT game, and we'll be finishing the show in a few minutes' time with the second part of my explanation of suspension. So if you're interested in that, do hang around for a few minutes while I just talk about racing games. Now, if you have time on your hands, your thoughts might be turning to some entertainment. You might be getting fed up with the television. So how about a motorcycle racing game? Well, over the years, I've dabbled with various GP and superbike games. And to be honest, I've never really got Part of the problem is that they tend to be fairly hard to master, particularly if you haven't got a controller that does the job properly. And I've never really splashed out for a big, expensive controller. So little joystick type things don't really seem to cut the mustard with those. But the learning curve seems to be quite steep, and you end up spending most of the time in the kitty litter, which means that the people you're racing against have long since disappeared into the distance. Years and years and years ago, and I mean years ago, I did have a very old demo of a TT game. I think if I remember right, you did 3 laps and the thing timed out. But any resemblance to the TT circuit was purely imaginary. It was about as realistic as doing a lap of Hyde Park Corner, actually. But I actually had a look at this new game, which has just been released, and it's called Man Ride on the Edge 2, which is a bit of a mouthful. But having looked at some of the video clips online and read a couple of the reviews, I have to say that the graphics are actually rather stunning. I'm certainly not a Manx expert, but I have ridden over there a few times. I've been to the TT a few times. I've actually run a training course over there years ago as well, and we were able to get out onto the TT circuit to do some of it. So I know enough of the circuit to be dangerous, as it were, but some of the iconic, and I do use that word iconic in this case, some of the iconic locations on the TT circuit are instantly recognizable from the video. The graphics really are just wonderful. So you're riding through this scenery, and it's just incredible, the detail that's put into it. And it's not just the road and the immediate environs of the road as well. If you actually look around at the scenery that is on display on either side of the track, you could take a slow amble around that TT circuit and actually enjoy the ride looking just at the scenery. So I'll be honest, I've not tried the game. I don't have a game control that works with my current PC or laptop. But having read some reviews online, the gameplay gets a generally positive thumbs up from people who do review these sorts of games. So that's a 1-up if you're. But one thing I would suggest is that if you're a beginner to these games, then it's probably going to be a fairly steep learning curve. I mean, at the best of times, the TT circuit isn't exactly forgiving. So hopefully there are some nice artificial intelligence style rider aids built into the program to help keep you on track and let you actually complete a lap without too many crashes into the undergrowth. There are usual range of machines that you can choose from. I think there are 10 different bikes. There are different classes also available that you can try out, including Classic, actually, which sounds quite interesting. I wonder if they've got any of those Honda 255s or the 6-cylinder Honda. I did see one of those at the TT one year doing the parade lap, and it was amazing. So yeah, that would be quite fun to ride around the TT circuit, wouldn't it? You get a career mode, which allows you to build up through an entire year of events. The events take place at different circuits across the UK, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, I believe, and they culminate with the TT event itself. So that's the career mode. And there are various quick start ones where you can basically jump in and start riding. Okay, if there is a letdown in the game anywhere, it's for perhaps the most serious gamers, and that's the multiplayer gameplay online. I've read a couple of reviews who said it doesn't work very well. Well, I'm not quite sure what they mean by it, but T is a time trial. That's what TT stands for. So the riders in the race anyway set off at 30-second intervals. So it's not like a GP or a superbike game where there's a lot of dicing between bikes going on. You'll often, I would imagine, even on the game, you'll be riding in a bubble where you're not actually seeing many other bikes. So you're really riding against the track and not other people. And if that's what people are complaining about, well, that's realistic. That's how the TT works. Now, if I wasn't pinching the pennies at the moment, I would consider splashing some cash on this. I think the price is £50. Don't quote me on that, but go and have a look online. You'll find it. At the moment, you can get it on Xbox One, PlayStation, and PC, and Nintendo Switch version is coming soon. So I'll give you the link to that. The game is called TT Isle of Man Ride on the Edge 2. I'll give you a link to find it. Right, okay. So just to remind you, watching Kevin Williams here on Elevenses, and the show will be recorded. It will be available on Facebook to watch later, and I'm also now uploading them to my new YouTube channel, so you'll be able to catch up with this show and all the other shows if you've missed part of it or you've missed previous shows. So keep an eye open for those. And now we're going to move on and have a look at suspension, and I didn't get my prop ready. In fact, I've put my prop somewhere and I can't find it. What have I done with it? Here it is. I did get it ready after all. Right, okay, so basically, to come back to what I was talking about last time, I was talking about braking and how weight transfer affects the motorcycle on braking. And if you brake, we know that the bike tends to go down on the front suspension. The front suspension compresses, and it's not just the suspension that compresses, but as we hit bumps, the tire itself acts a bit like a balloon and will compress under load. Now, the obvious corollary of that is that it will also expand when that load is removed. So if we hit a bump on the brakes, when the forks themselves are compressed, then the tire has to take up the slack, as it were, and absorb the bump. So the tire compresses, and as soon as you hit the top of the bump and the surface falls away from under the tire again, that tire expands. And what that does is it changes the width of the contact patch, and that in turn changes the amount of grip that we have at the front. Hit a bad bump hard on the brakes and the front tire will lock over that bump. Now, ABS will sort that out for you, but it's still a bit disconcerting. And as I said, what tends to happen is with a non-ABS bike, we can lock the front now and slide it. With an ABS bike, the ABS will trigger. Now, if we're upright, we'll just go in a straight line, relatively easy to sort out. But if we're leant over, the danger is that the front will slide out away from us. So ideally, all the braking needs to be done in a straight line. That's why on a road which is bumpy, we don't try to carry front brake into a corner, because of the danger of that front wheel sliding out away from us under the brakes. What about the rear? Now, I mentioned the weight transfer. Turn the bike around. When we accelerate, the weight transfer goes the other way. It goes towards the back of the bike. That gives the back wheel a little bit more grip. It digs in a little bit harder, and in a straight line, again, we have plenty of grip. We can accelerate quite hard coming out of a corner. Now, should the rear tire actually lose grip, and again, it can do that over bumps, or if we're too brutal with the throttle, or if we get a slippery patch. Now, the road surfaces aren't ideal, they do have slippery patches. Then what can happen, of course, then is that we can get wheel spin. Now, again, if we're traveling in a straight line, we simply wheel spin in a straight line. Even with traction control, that wheel spin will be controlled by the traction control. That's what it's there for. But if it happens, what a lot of people tend to do is shut the throttle to remove the wheel spin, even with traction control. So the problem is that the bike will go in a straight line, but either our throttle hand recovers grip or the traction control does it for us. But the bike is upright and it continues in a straight line. But if we try to put the power on mid-corner, if we're too early with the power, what happens next? Well, the answer is that with a non-traction control motorcycle, and there are still plenty of those around, if that front tire suddenly spins and loses grip, that back tire is going to slide out from under the rider. Now, what happens next? If you are lucky, you'll get off the power quick enough, and with a bit of a wobble, shimmy, the bike will come back into line. If you're not so lucky, the back will continue going round, and it is possible to get it so far out of line that the bike simply slides out from under you, and you do what's called a low side crash. The other possibility is that the back goes round, but the bike stays a bit more vertical. And now what happens is you get two tyres broadside onto the road. The contact patch, remember, is longer that way than it is wide that way. So the problem is that you suddenly get two big contact patches gripping the tyre, and now what happens with the bike side onto the road is it flips. That's called a high side crash. The result of a high side crash is a short flight. You get a good view from up there, but the landing is hard. Trust me on that. I've done it in the past myself. So the answer is, on a road bike, on the road, to get the bike all the way around the corner on a steady, constant throttle. Make sure the bike is actually turned completely, get it upright, and then power it out. You've probably read or heard or seen somewhere video telling you that you can feed the power on progressively harder from the midpoint of the corner. Well, I've just told you the first reason that you don't do that. Not on the road. It's a track technique. Why does it work on the track and not on the road? Well, two reasons. First of all, the track is much, much wider than the road. When we're working down at Brands Hatch on the ride skills courses, one of the things that I do tell people to do in the briefings I give them is to get on the power from the midpoint of the corner, and what it will allow the bike to do is it will push the bike out in the turn. Because if you remember what happens to the radius of a turn, if you are at constant speed, the radius of the turn stays constant too. But the moment you accelerate in a curve, then at the same lean angle, the radius of your curve instantly starts to grow. So that will automatically push you out to the edge of the track. Now, on the Brands Hatch track, you've got loads and loads and loads of room. Most of the novices actually find it really quite difficult to use anything like all of the track the first few laps. And this is one way to actually start to exploit it. Get the power on from the midpoint of the corner and drive the bike out wider, and use that power and the width of the track to advantage. But how much room have you got on the road by comparison? Well, the average road is probably about one, or the average lane, I should say, because we're not even operating on the whole width of a road, just one lane. The average width of a lane that we're operating on is probably about 1/5 or 1/6 of the width of Brands Hatch circuit. And that means that if we start to try to feed the power in early in the corner, and we start pushing the bike wide in the turn, we very quickly run out of lane. And that pushes us right out to the edge of the lane and potentially into trouble. If you think about going round a right-hand bend in the UK, where we're on the left-hand side of the road, our exit line, if we start pushing ourselves to the edge of that lane, will be where the camber is starting to fall away from under our tyres. If we're going the other way, if we're going around the left-hander, and we start feeding the power in too early and we start pushing the bike wide, we're pushing the bike out towards oncoming traffic. So in either case, that's not great for our mental sort of good health. The next problem that we have is that we actually need to keep our attention up and around the bend. And if we're starting to run ourselves wide in the corner because we put the power on too early, our focus will be simply staying on the bit of lane that we're already on. What we won't be doing is looking further ahead to see where the road goes. And the result is we're likely to do silly things like run into S-bends without having seen the second half of the S-bend. That's a surprisingly common crash. Or maybe we won't spot a junction with an emerging car just around the corner. And that's because our focus is on just staying on the road. So again, how do we solve those problems? Well, the answer is get the bike turned, get it upright, and then put the power on. As Keith Coates says in his book, you can pull a wheelie if you want to at that point, because the bike is aimed exactly where you want it to go. But the key is get round the corner on a constant throttle, constant speed more or less, and then harder acceleration coming out of the bend. So, okay, it sorts out problems with traction. It sorts out problems with the road not being as wide as a racetrack, and it sorts out our mental ability to look down the road and in front of us. Something that we're very fond of saying on advanced training courses is lift your eyes, look down the road, see what comes next. Well, this is one of the ways to do it. Delay getting that power on until you're actually round the corner. How much does it cost you in real terms around the corner? Well, actually, very, very little indeed, because what you'll find is if you're trying to feed the power on too early in the corner, you can only feed the power in very gently anyway. So just by getting the bike turned on a steady throttle, you can actually get the corner squared off and you can get the bike upright sooner. So then, once you're upright, you can get on the power harder. That's the basis of what I call point and squirt cornering, which is one of the features of my training, which you can find all about on my e-course. It's one of the things I'll be covering on the e-learning course, which I've set up now. Okay, so have a think about that. The trick is slow into a corner using the brakes upright in a straight line in plenty of time, back on the throttle before we actually reach the bend, so that we get the bike stabilized on the suspension so it works effectively over the bumps mid-corner, and then we get the bike turned and pointed where we want to go next before we apply any heavier throttle. Right, okay, well, that's about it for today's show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm going to come back to you next time out. I've got a tip on keeping your forearm muscles in good order. If you take time off the bike, one thing you'll find is suddenly that clutch, which was nice and light at the end of the summer, suddenly feels very, very heavy indeed. So I'll give you some tips on how to keep your forearm strength up. And we'll start looking at how to lay your bike up for an extended period too, because if you're not actually out there riding, I suspect we'll all be parked up for quite a while. Anything else that I wanted to say? I just wanted to run one of my banners past you, but I can't remember which one it was. I told you this is a work in progress. I hope you like the new studio setup. I'll keep this going and learn how to use it properly. And okay, so from Kevin Williams here, it's goodbye for today. We'll see you again in 2 days time at 11 with Elevenses. So thanks for watching. Remember that the video is available on catch up, and I'll also be popping it up onto my YouTube channel in a few minutes time. So hope you enjoyed the show. See you soon.